I've been with my wife Sarah for 7 years, married for 5 of them. We met in college during a group project that turned into late-night study sessions, that turned into coffee dates, that turned into a life together. She was brilliant and ambitious and made me want to be better. We bought a house in the suburbs 3 years ago, the kind with a front porch and a backyard, big enough for the kids we talked about having someday. I'm a software engineer, and she worked in marketing at a mid-sized firm downtown. Our life looked perfect from the outside, and for a long time I thought it was perfect on the inside too. The girls' nights started about 8 months ago. Sarah came home one evening and told me she'd reconnected with some college friends and they wanted to start meeting up monthly. Jenna, Rebecca, and Amanda, names I remembered from old stories and a few weddings we'd attended together. I thought it was great. I encouraged it, actually. I told her she should absolutely go spend time with her friends, that it was healthy for her to have her own social life outside our marriage. She seemed happy about it, and I felt like a supportive husband. That first night she left around 7 and came back around 11:30. She was smiling and relaxed and told me they'd gone to this new wine bar downtown and caught up on everything. She showed me a few photos on her phone of the 4 of them at a table with drinks. Everything seemed normal. The next month she went again and came back with similar stories. Then it became twice a month, then every week. By month 4 she was going out every Tuesday and sometimes Thursday too. I noticed small changes but didn't think much of them at first. She started dressing differently for these nights out. Not party clothes or anything revealing, but professional. Tailored blazers and nice blouses and heels that seemed too formal for casual drinks with friends. When I mentioned it, she laughed and said they'd started meeting at nicer places and she wanted to look put together. That made sense to me. She also started coming home later, sometimes not until 1 in the morning. She'd go straight to the shower and then straight to bed, barely saying goodnight. When I asked about her evening, she'd give vague answers about who said what and where they ate, nothing specific. I ran into Jenna at the grocery store on a Tuesday evening around 8. I was picking up ingredients for dinner later that week and saw her in the produce section. I walked over smiling and said something about how Sarah must have just left her to come meet me here. Jenna looked confused. She said she hadn't seen Sarah in months, that their schedules hadn't lined up. I felt my stomach drop but kept smiling. I said I must have been confused about which night it was and quickly changed the subject. Jenna mentioned she thought Sarah had been really busy with work stuff lately because she'd been declining their group chat invitations. We talked for another minute and then I excused myself. I stood in my car in the parking lot trying to make sense of it. Sarah had left our house 2 hours ago saying she was meeting Jenna and the girls for dinner. Jenna clearly had no idea what I was talking about. I sat there for probably 20 minutes just staring at the steering wheel. When Sarah came home that night around midnight, I was still awake. I asked casually how her evening was. She smiled and launched into this detailed story about the restaurant they went to and how Jenna was thinking about changing jobs and Rebecca's new boyfriend seemed nice. She described the entire evening with specific details and names and moments. I knew she was lying and I didn't know what to do about it. I started paying attention to things I'd been ignoring. The next day I grabbed our shared iPad to look something up and found LinkedIn open. Sarah's profile was on the screen. I'd never seen this version of it before. She'd updated her professional photo to one I'd never seen her take. Her summary section was completely rewritten with language that sounded like it came from a career coach. Her skills section had new endorsements from people whose names I didn't recognize. I scrolled through her connections and saw dozens of recruiters and HR professionals and people with titles like talent acquisition specialist and executive headhunter. She connected with all of them in the last 6 months. I opened our credit card statements that night after she went to bed. There were charges I'd glossed over before, but now they formed a pattern. A professional resume writing service, 3 different career coaching sessions, registration fees for networking events downtown, a subscription to some executive job board I'd never heard of, lunch meetings at expensive restaurants in the business district on weekdays when she should have been at her regular office. I took screenshots of everything and stored them in a locked folder on my phone. Her calendar app was synced to the iPad. I opened it, feeling guilty but needing to know. The Tuesday and Thursday evenings were blocked off with GNO, which I assume meant girls' night out, but there were other appointments scattered throughout her weeks, coffee meetings with initials I didn't recognize, lunch blocks labeled informational interview, and networking. She'd been taking half days from work at least twice a week for the last 3 months. Every entry was color-coded differently from her work meetings, like she was keeping a separate system for whatever this was. 2 weeks after I ran into Jenna, I decided to work from home on a Wednesday. I told Sarah I'd be at the office all day, like usual. She left for work at 8, like she always did. I set up my laptop at the kitchen table and tried to focus on code, but kept watching the clock. At 2 in the afternoon, I heard her car pull into the driveway. I quickly moved to the bedroom where I could see out the window without being seen. She sat in the car for several minutes, looking down at something in her lap. She was wearing a navy suit I'd never seen before, the kind you wear to serious business meetings. She had a leather portfolio on the passenger seat. I watched her mouth moving like she was rehearsing something. Then she checked her makeup in the rearview mirror and took several deep breaths. She got out of the car and I heard her open the trunk. When she came around the side of the house toward the front door, the portfolio was gone. She'd hidden it in the trunk. I moved back to the kitchen and pretended to be on a work call when she came in. She looked startled to see me and asked what I was doing home. I said I'd had a slow afternoon and decided to finish out the day here. She nodded and said she'd left work early because she had a headache. Then she went upstairs and I heard the shower running. When she came back down 20 minutes later, she was in leggings and a t-shirt like she'd been home all afternoon. The navy suit was nowhere to be seen. We made dinner together and she acted completely normal. I felt like I was living with a stranger. That evening, after we'd gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling while Sarah breathed evenly beside me. Around midnight, I got up and went out to her car. I told myself I was just checking, that I'd find nothing and feel foolish, and this would all be paranoia. I opened the trunk with my set of keys. The leather portfolio was there tucked behind the emergency kit. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were printed copies of her resume, 3 different versions tailored to different types of positions, references from colleagues I'd never heard her mention, a list of questions and practiced answers in her handwriting, notes about company cultures and management styles, business cards from recruiters and hiring managers held together with a rubber band. Every piece of paper was evidence of a life she was building, without me. I put everything back exactly how I'd found it and went inside. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for over an hour. When I finally went back to bed, Sarah hadn't moved. I wanted to shake her awake and demand answers, but I was afraid of what she'd say. Some part of me still hoped there was an explanation that made sense, that didn't mean what I thought it meant. The next evening, we were having dinner when her phone buzzed on the table between us. She reached for it quickly, but I saw the notification. It was a calendar alert that read, "Final round, Executive Director position, 10 a.m. Friday." She saw that I'd seen it. For half a second her face went blank, like she was calculating what to say. Then she smiled and picked up her phone. She said, "Oh, that's for Amanda. She's applying for this big promotion, and I've been helping her practice her interview answers." I nodded and said that was nice of her. Amanda managed a retail store. There was no executive director position in retail store management. I started keeping notes on my phone. Every time something didn't add up, I'd write it down with the date and time. Sarah said she was meeting Jenna for lunch, but I'd seen Jenna post on social media that she was out of town that day. Sarah said she had a work dinner on Thursday, but came home in completely different clothes than she'd left in. Sarah mentioned a coworker's name in a story, but I'd heard that same story 2 weeks earlier with a different coworker's name. The list grew longer every few days. I found business cards in her coat pocket when I was taking it to get dry cleaned. 6 different cards from 6 different people. 3 recruiters, 2 HR directors, one with a title like Chief People Officer at some tech startup. They were from companies in different cities. Denver, Seattle, Boston, Austin, Portland. All of them, at least 1,000 miles from where we lived. I put the cards back and took photos of them first. I did something I'm not proud of. I created a fake LinkedIn profile. I used a stock photo of a professional-looking man in his 40s and made up a name and a job title at a recruiting firm. I listed experience in executive placement and talent acquisition. Then I sent Sarah a message. I said I'd come across her profile and was impressed by her background. I said I was working with a client in Austin who was looking for someone with her exact skill set for a director of marketing strategy position. I asked if she'd be interested in learning more. She responded in less than an hour. Her message was enthusiastic and polished. She thanked me for reaching out and said she was absolutely interested in hearing more about the opportunity. She attached her resume without me even asking for it. I opened the attachment and read through it, feeling sick. Every bullet point was an achievement I'd never heard her talk about. Leadership roles she downplayed when telling me about her day. Projects she described as team efforts that she was now taking full credit for. At the bottom it said, "References available upon request," and I wondered who she listed. Certainly not me. I was her husband and I'd never been asked to be a reference. The line that made my hands shake said, "Currently employed but ready to relocate for the right opportunity." Relocate. She was ready to relocate. We'd never discussed moving. We'd bought this house together 3 years ago and spent weekends painting the rooms and choosing furniture and planning where the swing set would go someday. She was ready to leave all of that, ready to leave me, and she was telling strangers on the internet before she'd said a word to me. I couldn't hold it in anymore. That night after dinner, I pulled out the business cards and put them on the table in front of her. I asked what they were. I asked why she was interviewing for jobs in cities across the country. Sarah's face went completely white and then immediately red. She stood up and asked if I'd been going through her things. I said I'd found them by accident, and that wasn't the point. The point was, what are you doing? Are you leaving? Are you leaving me? She started crying, real tears streaming down her face while she told me she didn't know. She said she didn't know what she wanted. She said she'd been feeling trapped and unfulfilled and like she was disappearing into our life together. She said her career had stalled, and she felt like she was supposed to want the house and the marriage and the future kids, but she didn't know if she actually wanted any of it. She said she'd been exploring options because she needed to know what else was out there. She said she hadn't told me because she wasn't sure yet and didn't want to hurt me if it turned out to be nothing. I asked her directly if she'd accepted any job offers. She said no. I asked if she was planning to. She said she didn't know. I asked how she thought this would work, if she was just going to come home one day and announce she'd taken a job in Seattle and I could come with her or not. She said she hadn't thought that far ahead. Everything about her body language told me she was lying. She thought very far ahead. She thought through every detail except the part where she had to tell me. She promised to stop. She said she'd turn down any future interviews and we'd work on our marriage and figure out what was making her unhappy. She held my hands across the table and said she loved me and didn't want to lose me. I wanted desperately to believe her. We started a couples therapy the following week. Sarah seemed engaged in the sessions. She talked about feeling like we'd grown apart and how she needed more independence and stimulation. She said she'd been wrong to go behind my back, but that I also needed to understand her perspective. The therapist nodded along and suggested we work on our communication. She gave us exercises to do at home about expressing needs and active listening. Sarah did all of them. She planned date nights. She turned down girls' nights and stayed home. She was more present when we talked. I started to relax. I stopped checking her LinkedIn every day. I stopped going through her calendar. I told myself we were fixing it. 6 weeks into therapy, Sarah came home bursting with excitement. She said she'd gotten a new job. Better title, significant raise, more responsibility. I felt this rush of relief and happiness. She'd stayed. She'd chosen us. She'd chosen me. The job was in the same city at a company about 20 minutes from our house. We went out to dinner to celebrate, and she talked about the new team and the project she'd be working on and how this was exactly the kind of challenge she'd been craving. We talked about what we'd do with the extra money, maybe finally renovate the kitchen, maybe start seriously trying for a baby. Everything felt possible again. The new job came with a lot of travel. Sarah explained that the company had clients all over the country, and she'd need to be on site at least 2 or 3 days, most weeks. Usually Tuesday through Thursday. She'd fly out Tuesday morning and be back Thursday evening or Friday morning. It meant we'd really only see each other on weekends, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. I said I understood, and I was proud of her. She seemed happy in a way I hadn't seen in over a year. The first few weeks of travel were hard, but manageable. She texted me photos of her hotel room and the cities she was visiting. She'd call before bed, and we'd talk about our days. When she came home on weekends, she was energized and affectionate. Our sex life actually improved dramatically, but something about it felt off in a way I couldn't name. It felt performative, like she was playing the role of excited wife rather than actually being excited. I started noticing that the cities she traveled to were familiar. Denver one week, Seattle the next, Boston, Portland, Austin. The same cities from the business cards I'd found months earlier. I told myself it was coincidence. These were major cities with lots of businesses. Of course her company had clients there. But the pattern gnawed at me. 3 months into her new job, Sarah suggested I go visit my family for a week. My parents lived across the country and I hadn't seen them in over a year. She said I never took time off and she'd be traveling most of that week anyway, so I might as well go. It made sense, but something about the way she suggested it felt wrong, like she was trying to get me out of the house. I booked the trip anyway because I did miss my family and I was probably being paranoid. The week before I was supposed to leave, I checked her calendar out of old habit. She was scheduled to be in Denver Tuesday through Thursday. On impulse, I looked up her company and the clients they supposedly worked with in Denver. I called the main office pretending to be coordinating a meeting and asked about their Denver client site. The receptionist said they didn't have any current contracts in Denver. I asked if maybe it was a new client, and she said she handled all the client logistics and there was definitely nothing in Denver. I thanked her and hung up. I canceled my trip to see my parents. I told Sarah I'd pushed it back a few weeks because of a work deadline. She seemed disappointed but said she understood. That Tuesday morning she left for the airport with her rolling suitcase and her laptop bag. She kissed me goodbye and said she'd call when she landed. I watched her drive away, and then I booked a flight to Denver leaving that afternoon. I called the hotel she'd stayed at on previous Denver trips. I'd seen the name on a receipt in her email once. I asked if they had a reservation for Sarah and gave our last name. The front desk agent said no. I asked if maybe it was under her company name and gave that. Still no. I asked if they had any kind of corporate contract with her company and the agent. Said no. They'd never worked with that company. I thanked them and sat on hold with 3 other hotels in the area. None of them had any record of Sarah or her company. I flew to Denver anyway. I landed Tuesday evening and took an Uber to the hotel district where I knew she usually stayed. I sat in the lobby of the hotel she'd mentioned most often. I'd brought flowers like I was planning some romantic surprise. I sat there for 3 hours. She never showed up. I called her and she answered saying she was in meetings all day and would call me back later. I asked what hotel she was staying at, and she said the same one she always stayed at in Denver. She said she had to go and hung up. I was sitting in the lobby of that hotel and she wasn't there. I hired a private investigator. I found one through a friend of a friend who promised discretion. I gave him Sarah's information and asked him to figure out where she actually was when she said she was traveling for work. He said he'd have something for me within a week. It was the longest week of my life. Sarah came home that Friday like nothing was wrong. We had a normal weekend. We went to dinner. We watched movies on the couch. She was affectionate and present, and I felt insane. The investigator called me at work the following Tuesday. He asked if I could meet him that evening. I left work early and met him at a coffee shop across town. He handed me a folder and I sat there staring at it for a full minute before opening it. Inside were photos and documents and timelines that made my entire world collapse. Sarah's new job was real, but it wasn't what she'd told me. The position was fully remote. She wasn't traveling for client meetings. She'd rented an apartment in Seattle 6 weeks after starting the new job. The apartment was in her name only with a year-long lease. The investigator had photos of her going in and out of the building. Photos of her at a nearby coffee shop that was clearly part of her regular routine. Photos of her at the grocery store. She'd furnished the entire place. The photos through the windows showed her furniture, her books, her decorations. She built a whole life there. There were also photos of her with a man. They were having dinner at what looked like a nice restaurant, walking together through a park, standing outside an office building talking. The investigator said he'd identified the man as David Chen, the VP of marketing at her company. He was her direct supervisor. He was married with 2 kids. The investigator didn't think it was an affair based on their body language in public, but they were clearly close. He'd done some digging and found that David knew about Sarah's arrangement. She'd told him she was working through some things in her marriage and splitting her time between Seattle and home for now. I read through the investigator's notes feeling completely numb. Sarah had been living in Seattle Tuesday through Thursday every single week. She'd come home Friday through Monday and pretended everything was normal. She'd built an entire separate life complete with routines and relationships and a boss who knew more about her situation than her own husband did. She'd been doing this for 3 months, 90 days of living a double life, while I smiled and told her I was proud of her new job. I didn't tell Sarah I knew. I booked a flight to Seattle for the next Thursday morning. I got the address of her apartment from the investigator's report. I took a red-eye Wednesday night and landed in Seattle at 6 in the morning. I got coffee and walked around until 9. Then I took an Uber to her building. The building was nice. New construction in a trendy neighborhood with coffee shops and restaurants within walking distance. Exactly the kind of place Sarah always said she wished we lived. I went up to the 3rd floor and found her apartment number. I stood outside the door for several minutes trying to decide what to say. Then I knocked. Sarah opened the door in pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt with a coffee mug in her hand. When she saw me, her face went through about 6 different expressions in 2 seconds. Shock, fear, guilt, calculation, resignation. She stepped back and I walked in without waiting for an invitation. The apartment was completely lived in. Photos of her family on the walls, her favorite blanket on the couch, books I recognized from her house on the shelves, a kitchen stocked with her preferred brands of everything, her running shoes by the door, a calendar on the wall with her workouts and social plans marked in her handwriting. This wasn't a temporary place she was staying for work. This was her home. She had 2 homes and I'd only known about one of them. Sarah started crying immediately. She set down her coffee mug and just stood there with tears streaming down her face. She said she was going to tell me. She said she'd been planning to tell me. I asked when. When exactly? Was she planning to tell me about this? She didn't have an answer. I walked through the apartment while she followed me trying to explain. I opened the closet and saw her work clothes hanging there. I opened the bathroom cabinet and saw her toiletries, the expensive face cream she special ordered, her prescription bottles. Everything was duplicated. She had a whole second set of her life here. In the bedroom, I saw photos of us on her nightstand, and that somehow made it worse. She was living this separate life, but still keeping me in it like I was part of the set dressing. I sat down on her couch and told her to explain everything. She sat across from me and talked for almost an hour. She said she'd accepted the Seattle job 2 months into our couples therapy. The job was real, and it was remote, but the company was based in Seattle, and they'd suggested she work from the headquarters for the first few months to integrate with the team. She'd said yes without telling me. She'd found the apartment and signed the lease and moved her things in gradually over several trips. She'd been living here Tuesday through Thursday every week and flying home Thursday night or Friday morning to spend the weekend with me. She said she'd planned to transition slowly. She'd tell me eventually that the company wanted her in Seattle more permanently. She suggested we try long distance for a while. She'd see if I wanted to move with her or if maybe we needed time apart. She'd been building toward a conversation she didn't know how to have. In the meantime, she was living both lives and trying to figure out which one she actually wanted. I asked about David, her boss. She said he knew she was married and knew she was splitting time between cities. She'd been honest with him that she was working through things in her marriage. He'd been supportive and professional about it. They were friends, but nothing more. The investigator had been right about that at least. It wasn't an affair. It was something worse. It was her building a complete exit strategy while keeping me as a backup plan in case it didn't work out. I asked her why. Why not just tell me she was unhappy? Why not suggest we move together, or try long distance, or even separate if that's what she needed? Why all the deception and double life and lies? She said she didn't want to hurt me. She said she didn't want to blow up our life together until she knew for sure this was what she wanted. She said she thought she could keep both options open until she figured it out. She said she knew it was selfish and cowardly and wrong. She said she never meant for it to go this far. I asked her what the plan was. Was she just going to keep living this double life indefinitely? Was she going to eventually tell me she needed to relocate for work and see if I'd follow her? What happened when I said no, or when she decided she liked her Seattle life better than her life with me? She said she didn't know. She said she'd been taking it week by week and not thinking about the endgame. That was probably the only honest thing she said all morning. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything or make a scene. I felt strangely calm, like I was watching this happen to someone else. I told Sarah that I would have supported her career. I would have moved with her if she'd asked. I would have tried long distance if that's what she needed. I would have gone to therapy and worked on whatever was broken between us. But she didn't give me any of those options. She chose to lie and deceive and build a secret life, instead of having a hard conversation with her husband. I told her she'd made me her backup plan. She'd kept me around in case her Seattle experiment didn't work out. She'd let me believe we were building a future together while she was actively building a future without me. That wasn't marriage. That wasn't partnership. That was her using me as insurance while she figured out if she could do better. I told her to stay in Seattle. I said I was filing for divorce and she should find herself a lawyer. She started sobbing and saying she'd made a terrible mistake and she wanted to fix this and she'd give up the apartment and the job and everything if I'd just give her another chance. I said no. I said there was no coming back from this level of betrayal and deception. I said I deserve better than being someone's safety net. I left the apartment and took an Uber back to the airport. I flew home and sat in the empty house we'd bought together and felt the weight of everything that had just ended. My phone started buzzing with texts from Sarah. Long paragraphs apologizing and explaining and begging for another chance. I turned off my phone and sat in the silence. I told my family first, then I told our close friends. Everyone was shocked. Everyone had thought we were happy. Several of Sarah's friends reached out to say they'd had no idea what she was doing. Jenna called me crying and apologizing for not pushing harder when things seemed off months ago. I told her it wasn't her fault. Sarah had been lying to everyone, not just me. The divorce was relatively straightforward. No kids. Assets split fairly evenly. She kept the Seattle apartment and her job. I kept the house. We had to communicate through lawyers because I couldn't stand to talk to her. Every email from her attorney made me angry all over again. She was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to make herself the victim who'd just been confused and scared. She left out the part where she'd actively deceived me for almost a year. The divorce was final. 6 months after I showed up at her Seattle apartment. 6 months to legally end a marriage that had probably actually ended a year before that, when she started interviewing for escape routes. I sold the house 2 months later. Too many memories. Too many rooms we'd painted together with plans that would never happen. I moved into a downtown apartment and started over. I went to therapy by myself this time. A different therapist who specialized in betrayal and rebuilding trust. We talked about covert exit strategies and how some people dismantle their marriages piece by piece while the other person has no idea it's happening. We talked about emotional affairs people have with their imagined future selves. We talked about how the signs had been there, but I'd chosen comfort over confrontation because facing the truth was too scary. I started recognizing the pattern in hindsight. The girls' nights had been her practicing being single again, going out alone and coming home to a separate space and not having to answer to anyone. The updated LinkedIn and the interviews had been her testing the market to see what else was out there. The new job hadn't been about career growth. It had been about creating the infrastructure to leave. Every decision she'd made for over a year had been about building an exit while keeping me in the dark. A year. After the divorce was final, I ran into Jenna again. We got coffee and caught up. She told me Sarah was engaged to someone she'd met in Seattle. Some guy who worked in tech and had never been married before. Jenna had seen it on social media. She asked if I was okay and I realized I actually was. It hurt, but not the way it used to. I'd done a lot of work in therapy and I'd started dating again. Nothing serious yet, but I was open to it. I thought about Sarah sometimes and wondered if she'd told her new fiancé the truth about how our marriage ended. I wondered if he knew she was capable of building a secret life while smiling across the dinner table every night. I wondered if she'd do it to him eventually when things got hard or boring or when she started fantasizing about her next escape route. Then I stopped wondering because it wasn't my problem anymore. The thing nobody tells you about betrayal like this is that it doesn't feel like a sudden explosion. It feels like discovering that the ground beneath you has been eroding for months and you just didn't notice until you fell through. Sarah didn't wake up one day and decide to leave. She left gradually over the course of a year. Every interview was her leaving a little more. Every business card from a recruiter in a different city was her taking another step away. Every girls' night she lied about was her practicing life without me. By the time I figured it out, she was already gone. I'd just been too trusting or too naive or too comfortable to see it. I'm more careful now, maybe too careful. I pay attention to inconsistencies. I ask follow-up questions. I don't ignore my gut when something feels off. Some people might call that trust issues or baggage. I call it pattern recognition. I learned the hard way that the person sleeping next to you can be planning an exit strategy while telling you they love you. That someone can live a double life so seamlessly you never suspect until you're standing in their secret apartment watching your marriage collapse in real time. Sarah didn't just interview for a new job. She interviewed for a new life. She auditioned for a different future in a different city with different possibilities that didn't include me, and I was the only one who didn't know I was being written out of the script. The girls' nights weren't about friendship or independence or self-care. They were rehearsals for the life she was planning to live without me. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she practiced being the version of herself that didn't come home to our house, or our marriage, or our plans for kids and kitchen renovations and growing old together. I'm okay now. Differently happy than I was before, but genuinely happy. I have good friends and interesting work and hobbies I never had time for when I was trying to save a marriage that was already over. I go rock climbing twice a week, and I'm training for a marathon, and I've traveled to places Sarah and I used to talk about visiting. Someday, I'm doing all of it without someone who's only half present while secretly building an escape route. The last time I heard anything about Sarah was from a mutual friend who mentioned she'd bought a house in Seattle with her new fiancé. I felt nothing when I heard it. No anger or sadness or jealousy, just this distant sense of dodging something that would have destroyed me eventually. If she hadn't slipped up, if I hadn't hired that investigator, I could have spent years living half a marriage while she maintained her double life. I could have watched her pull away gradually and blamed myself for not being enough to make her stay. Instead, I got out. It was painful and messy and felt like the end of the world, but I got out before I wasted any more years on someone who was already gone.